The big issue when we talk about China invading Taiwan, although what's much more likely is the isolation of the island, is semiconductors. And the modern economy simply cannot exist without a flow of these. And one thing that impresses me is how people have no idea about the breadth of the word economy. Most people think of numbers, stock markets, or things like that, let's say abstract things, but understand by the word economy your way of life, your standard of living. From the electronic devices you use every day, to the cars you use to get around, and even the hospital equipment when you need to have tests done. Economy is everything. It's the arithmetic foundation of our reality. And in today's video, we're going to look at an important aspect, which silently and gradually is shaping geopolitics, possibly even dooming the future of Taiwan. But first, remember to subscribe and share the video with everyone you know. Your help is absolutely essential for the Geopolitica Mundial channel to keep existing. So word of mouth, keyboard to keyboard, phone to phone, your help is very important. My name is Adriano Pera and this is the Geopolitica Mundial channel. Recently, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, a semiconductor manufacturing company from Taiwan, opened a facility in Japan in partnership with Japan Advanced Semiconductor Manufacturing, an advanced semiconductor manufacturer in Japan. At the inauguration, the Japanese government announced even more loans, aiming for a second phase of expansion in the partnership, and is even planning a third phase of investments. In other words, Japan is playing hard in its ambitious plan to become Taiwan's replacement. Officially, this is not a replacement, but it would be an expansion of production outside of Taiwan to lower market costs and increase supply for the ever-growing global demand. But in practice, it's about not running the risk that if something happens in Taiwan involving a war, the global supply chain will be affected. Actually, the United States should already be ahead in this process, because Japan Advanced Semiconductor Manufacturing only announced its project at the end of 2020, more than a year after Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company had started building its hub in the state of Arizona. So, Japan completed the first phase of construction in just over 20 months while the United States is still in the construction phase. That's no small feat, because the potential behind Taiwan's Semiconductor Manufacturing Company is something that can have a huge influence on geopolitics. Semiconductors are produced in wafers embedded in woofers over many months, using a sequence called the process flow. The process flow is made up of hundreds of process steps. Each step involves one of the main functions of semiconductors: oxidation, deposition, photolithography, cleaning, chemistry. I've already explained this on the channel in another video which I'll link in the description. Here's the link to explain the process step by step. Because this whole process involves up to about 500 high-tech tools. Then to go into a clean and sterilized room where particles of a certain size are not allowed. Currently, it takes on average between 1 year and 9 months to 2 years and 3 months to finish a factory of this configuration. But Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company's goal is to reduce that even further. But the question is, why did Japan do so much better than the United States in creating its semiconductor hub? And it's hard to answer because there are accusations ranging from a deliberate delay so that Taiwan maintains its relevance in Asian geopolitics, remaining too important to be abandoned by the United States, to excessive bureaucracy and labor difficulties in hiring personnel on American soil. In any case, the company has already announced its intention to add another $40 billion in the next 2 phases of its hub in Arizona. And the United States is definitely obsessed with its mission to no longer depend on foreign countries for its semiconductor supply. This obsession comes politically from the American government and economically from Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company's own shareholders. But Japan's advantage may also be due to, let's say, more mundane reasons, such as having the most highly skilled workforce in the world. The geographical distance between Taiwan and Japan, the culture of the countries, which influences many businesses, and the fact that there is already a pre-existing infrastructure to accommodate Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. Today, Jasmine operates a set of much less sophisticated processes using 22 nanometer technologies, but will now start manufacturing the 7 nanometer class. The Arizona factory, on the other hand, announced that it would start with 5 nanometer manufacturing, but this was updated and the 4 nanometer technology was established as the initial one. However, the forecast now is that the facility will only begin operating in 2027 and 2028. In Japan, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company will start with 28 nanometers and only then, with no set deadline, focus on 16 nanometers. It seems that the company wants to avoid risks, instead taking cautious positions before starting on these points. It means more advanced technologies than those they have in Taiwan. This fact also delayed the Arizona hub opening, where the goal was to start producing 4 to 5 nanometers. And this 4 nanometer production has many more process steps than the 28 nanometer one, and the tolerance levels are much less forgiving. The former general counsel of Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company said in an interview that American paranoia caused an unusual focus on the most advanced process technologies, instead of on other technologies considered equally important. There would then be pressure from Washington to build its most advanced processes right from the start. This pressure would have increased even more because of the chip shortages between 2021 and 2022. Another favorable factor for Japan is that, while Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company in Arizona is alone, Japan Advanced Semiconductor Manufacturing is a joint venture involving other major partners such as Sony, Denso, and Toyota. This means that more than just investors, they are also customers, which guarantees in advance a comfortable amount of prior demand volume. This is interesting because Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company normally doesn't do this kind of business either in Taiwan or in the United States. Only for now in Japan. Although it's not known why they chose a joint venture in Japan, everything indicates, considering the profile of these companies, that this would involve the interests of the Japanese government itself. And they will repeat this at their hub in Germany, which is only expected to open in 2027 in Dresden, there in partnership with Bosch, Infineon, and NXP. The other factor in this context that deserves additional attention is the role of the public-private partnership. Unlike what the extremely liberal anti-government advocates preach, this type of venture is simply far beyond the financial capacity of almost any private group. Not only because of the amounts involved, but also due to the bureaucracy and politics, as well as the infrastructure needed to support these hubs. And also, contrary to what nationalists think, that everything should be state-owned. The state simply doesn't have the organization, coordination, agility, dynamism, or even the necessary access to maintain competitiveness in this area, which is so fluid and fast-paced. The private partnership is what makes the difference. Because Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, as well as Intel and Samsung, didn't start construction in the United States and Japan. Without financial subsidies and government support, subsidies are expected in the semiconductor industry. Everyone is doing this, including obviously China, which despite important advances still isn't able to keep up. Which is fundamental to being able to bypass the American sanctions based on the Creating Helpful Incentives to Produce Semiconductors Act. Japan actually subsidized the first construction with $3.5 billion, about 40% of the factory's total cost. The amount was announced in mid-2022, just 2 months after construction began. And unlike Banco Nacional de Desenvolvimento Econômico e Social, the Japanese and American government money comes with many conditions. In the American case, there are a series of restrictions due to national security, as well as broad protections, such as expansion and export barriers to China and Russia. And, in the Japanese case, rules that included a 10-year commitment or requirement to increase production in case of shortages. Safeguards for essential technologies and ongoing investments in the factory, which is located in Japan. However, despite the broad advantage that Japan has in 3 of the 4 stages in chip and semiconductor manufacturing, Jasmine had been stalled in innovation processes. This even affected the host city of Kumamoto, which was experiencing emigration. In other words, up to 40% of students who finished high school were leaving the city, looking for better jobs in other cities like Tokyo and Osaka. But the arrival of Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company managed to offer very competitive salaries and because of that, build the factory in a shorter period of time. Another factor I briefly mentioned but deserves more focus is the cultural factor. The cultural differences between workers from Taiwan and the Japanese are much smaller than those reported between the Taiwanese and the Americans. At Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, Arizona, American and foreign workers go through an intensive training program in Taiwan that lasts several months. This leads to a high turnover rate. Significant cultural differences between Taiwanese and Americans have hindered Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company's construction progress in the United States. One example is that recently Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company's president Mark Liu made an off-the-cuff comment during the earnings conference, bringing a specialized team of Taiwanese workers to the factory to install the equipment. Several labor unions in Arizona attacked him and the company and even pressured the government to block the vehicles. American and foreign workers go through a training process that results in a high rate of American workers. Intense training in Taiwan causes a high dropout rate and leads to many foreign workers. They go through a training program in Taiwan with social. This caught the company off guard, which, due to cultural differences, didn't really know how to deal with these local issues. The Arizona government then had to intervene directly to keep the project going and avoid further political incidents, organizing an agreement between the company and the unions. However, this adaptation delayed the factory's opening schedule even further. Another vital aspect that shows why Japan will probably become the new Taiwan of semiconductors is the regulations. The city of Kaohsiung in Taiwan was pressuring Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company to open another hub in the city. However, one of the problems was dealing with the water supply for these factories, which have a huge water consumption. To deal with this, the city's Department of Basic Sanitation created a task force to coordinate with the company on what needed to be done. And in just one day, all the processes and administrative procedures that needed to be resolved were resolved. But in today's United States, there are a number of much more complicated regulations that take away your competitiveness when compared to Asian countries, especially when it comes to carbon dioxide emissions and other labor tax or environmental aspects. In fact, that was one of the campaign issues during the first term of former President Donald Trump. Adjust the company to comply with environmental licenses, such as those for recovered pollutants, asbestos, waste transportation, and stormwater pollution prevention. And also new requirements such as mandatory racial, sexual, and religious diversity, among others. How the various federal, state, and municipal agencies have been a problem for large enterprises in the United States. Not just for Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, but add that to the shortage of materials, labor shortage, and transportation issues. See how problematic this is? Of course, not all of these regulations are useless. After all, the raw materials needed for semiconductor manufacturing are often very toxic and highly dangerous. And since they're not made in the United States, but rather, interestingly, in China, they need to be transported very carefully. Several factors are driving Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company to Japan, making it a replacement for Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company Taiwan rather than an expansion. In the long run, at best, a plan B in case of conflict between Taiwan and China. The geoeconomic impacts, and consequently also the geopolitical ones, start with the redefinition of the supply chain. Because Taiwan's Semiconductor Manufacturing Company is entry into Japan, will change the way the semiconductor supply chain works, reducing the dependence that the United States and East Asia have on Taiwan, which could easily be isolated or in an extreme case bombed. This means diversification and would bring greater stability and resilience to the sector. It would even affect the global semiconductor trade and, as a consequence, a considerable part of modern life all over the planet. Another aspect is regional cooperation. The collaboration between Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company Japan and other countries in the Asia-Pacific region will boost innovation and global competitiveness in the semiconductor sector. But the biggest one affected will be Taiwan, which will have less bargaining power to deal with China. In fact, it will have practically nothing, because what remains for it is the production of semiconductors. In theory, the United States, even without this productive technological factor, would still defend Taiwan because of its strategic position, serving as a kind of dagger pointed at China. Chinese belly, an island strategically positioned in front of the Chinese geopolitical core, which would limit any Chinese ambition in the Pacific, or at least make it more difficult. Because without Taiwan, China would be free to pressure American interests throughout the Pacific, whether it's the strategic island of Guam or even the American Naval Command itself, which is located in Hawaii. But it's a risk to rely on that. The question then is whether this Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company race out of Taiwan is just a process of diversification and market expansion. Or is it actually preparation for a bigger military event on the island? Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it. Remember to subscribe to the channel or follow us on Instagram and Telegram, and consider becoming a member. Not only will you get 1 month early access to the channel's videos, but you'll also have exclusive access to members-only content. Enjoy full podcasts, exclusive live streams, and direct Telegram interaction, all for members only. And you'll also be helping to keep the World Geopolitics project alive. Thank you all, and see you in the next video.